computer and stuff.
Yes.
And they said that about the phone too.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it's like the True Tone on the phone. I think it's called True Tone.
Yeah.
Well, how cool. I
I just read that yesterday.
Keeps more yellow light.
Just never.
Glasses, I mean, I can see.
I was in,
Yeah.
I thought he walked in with you.
You know, that ain't no.
And I thought y'all was in. I said, like, did y'all need to
It's
Is your glasses
It's cheap
back?
little
But he's
things
there
that
for
get from
Sebastian.
sale.
Oh, they just
I
magnifiers.
used that
I don't know what it
Are
is.
they prescription?
They
No, they're magnifiers.
Is it just something you get from sale?
So you can see. You can get rid of
Well, mine,
Yeah,
they told me
sitting
when I was
here,
going
got all the trucks
to
in the
renew
field,
my
and he's here.
license,
Because
they
he's the
said,
body,
go early in the
washing
morning.
it.
Because
The truck
that's when your
dealership on the
sight,
corner of Walker
diabetes, and that kind of
Interstate,
stuff can affect
that's all the same
everything.
company. He
So
works
go
for
in the
that
morning,
guy,
and that way
Jay
you can
Rose,
see really well
So
in the
this
morning
guy
time
here
because your
is
sugar's
buying
not
all
that
the
high.
trucks, bringing them to Jay.
But now I'm not on
That's it.
insulin because they said 5.4 you don't need to be
And I
on
keep
insulin.
telling you, I want to see a control.
So they took me off, but I wouldn't take myself off of
I wish I could tell
Ozempic.
you.
I kept myself on
I gotta
Ozempic,
go,
so I
don't
told
know,
my
I can't hear before it
primary
goes.
care, and she's like, that's okay.
I'm sorry, I can't do that for you. I said, well, I
She
was
said,
just
there's nothing wrong
asking.
with that. So,
That is still your number. I'm glad to know that, Leslie.
yeah, that is the one. That's right.
Mine's
Where
5.9.
does he go? He's saying
That's good.
Steady trying to get it down.
Yeah, that's really good.
Now what?
A1C number.
Yeah.
I thought something to die.
I don't
Oh, I
know.
thought you meant your glasses.
Oh,
No.
no, that
Oh, you talking about-
A1C has a
He's talking about his.
Okay.
I'm worried about mine are, so, because I'm limited.
Issues like
That, yeah, they're back.
Oh, okay. She
Yeah.
told me this morning they were back, and I said, well, I've been gone a couple of weeks, so I'm.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah, I know we got them on.
Good to have them back.
You said all that sugar started good last time.
Well, if it's good, then that's.
All right, so we're in chapter 16 of Genesis. Probably one of the best chapters in the whole book. You would think that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a mouthful.
Bible book.
The Genesis. There's a
Okay,
lot
I
to
was
learn
gonna
here. It's
say,
one of the
There's a lot of good stuff in this book.
yeah,
Not just Genesis.
yeah.
Read the
So
page
so when we look at the whole episode in context, what immediately precedes the story of Hagar and Ishmael is God's covenant with Abram, right? So it's the whole thing. He's God again, reminds him of the promise that he's made, that he's going to be the father of a great nation. And Abraham says, well, that all sounds real good, only I'm not a father.
And I'm an old man.
And I'm an old man.
I like your plan, but step it up.
Yeah. So we go through this whole dialogue with Abram and God, which kind of resembles the same dialogue that Moses has with God. If we want to look that far forward, we won't tonight, but he gets in a conversation where the implication by both Abram and Moses is, God, you're not doing enough, is kind of the implication. And so God, in the last part of chapter 15, performs a covenant ceremony with Abram to say, oh, yes, I am. And I'm not going to break my word, because breaking this covenant would mean destroying my character. It would violate my nature, and everything about who I am to you would utterly be destroyed. And so God is in no interest. He has no interest in destroying any type of relational understanding that he has with any of us. And that's why the promise is so sacred and so valuable to us. Not just as a people. God was providing the ancestors of Abram were wrapped up in the promise, but the relationship that God was pursuing was just with Abraham in this moment, in this time, in these circumstances, and he does us the same way. All right, so then we have then Hagar and Ishmael, and then after that we have another covenant ceremony. So when we take the three together and we see this episode crammed in the middle, we should pay really close attention because it disrupts the flow of what the writer is attempting to show us about God's relationship with Abram. And we understand the disruption once we get into the story, and how everything that, or so much of what Sarai is in the process of doing, is really undoing what God has already begun in his promise to them. And it's not unlike what we see in the Garden of Eden. So much of what was undone in the garden was done because Eve made moves to undo it. And it's not her total responsibility, because the directive not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not given to Eve. It was given to her husband. And so he was to carry the responsibility of that understanding between he and God with his wife. So we'll look at 16, because we already looked at 15, and possibly we'll get through some of 17. All right. So Abram's wife Sarai, who had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian. She owned an Egyptian slave, named Hagar. So here we are. We're already in a quagmire. We're not even through the first sentence hardly, because now we're operating out of a place not of blessing and giftedness, but of what a person owns and how they can manipulate what they own in order to bring about an end that they believe they must attain to.
And I think it's funny because it's an Egyptian.
Of all, yeah.
It's
Of
an
all the people
Egyptian.
that own, it's an Egyptian.
That's right. It's the only place they've been to buy a slave, I guess, is Egypt. So anyway, it's an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children.
It's all his fault.
Okay? So
Blame.
yeah, it's no mistake the way this is worded. It is really her saying, we're not responsible for this. This is God's problem. Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave, or go into my slave. Perhaps through her, I can build a family. All right? So we're far away from God's promise and what he's doing by this point, right? So in just really 2 short sentences here, the whole thing is kind of unraveled to fit in the hands of Sarai, taking it out of God's hands, and she's taking control of it, but only by proxy. She actually wants Abram to be in control of what happens. Okay, so isn't this a good way to learn how to live? You want something to happen, and you know that it's kind of outside what God's already said, so you're going to make somebody else responsible for what happens. This whole thing is messed up in two short sentences.
That's the truth.
And listen to the next line. And Abram agreed. Duh. I mean,
Abram listened to the voice of Sarah.
yeah. Well, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Yeah. So he agreed to this. So
he didn't stop anything.
right.
He
That's
didn't
right.
stop her and say,
Just like
this is
Adam.
what
That's
God
right.
said.
Just like
That's
Adam.
right.
He ain't
Right.
he ain't
God
This is what
said.
God said.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, all he had to do was say no.
Yeah.
It comes real easy, no.
So what are we looking at? He's already gone through the embarrassment and near tragedy in Egypt. He comes out of Egypt. God is now he's made a covenant with who? Abram. Just a in our minds, just a chapter before. He's made this covenant with Abram that is saying, you will. This is not a negotiated thing. I'm going to keep my word. But here Abram is now saying, and he agreed.
Sure, Sarah. What
Yeah.
do you say?
So Sarai's covenant, Sarai's agreement with Abram now takes precedent over any agreement that he's made with God. People, we do this all the time.
Maybe he's thinking, Sarai can't get pregnant. Maybe Hagar can't either. Because God said it's going to be Sarai, so maybe
He should have said that out
I'm
loud.
trying to help him out.
Yeah. Yeah. Now it was
But that
not.
is an interesting
It was not uncommon, of course, in this day for this to happen. This was a common everyday
Yeah, because they
part
wanted
of
to have it.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah.
And
So really, the more wives, the better, and because you could have
you're
a
definitely going to have a better chance of having heirs if you
Yeah.
have more opportunity.
yeah.
That's right.
But it sounds like, in the story though, that Hagar is taking care of the boy and all that. You would think that Sarah would.
Well, we're going to
He's
get.
supposed to be her son.
Yeah.
Her
But
heir.
Sarah was not pleasing God. She
Oh no!
Well,
I know.
and then God sets that straight when
Yeah.
she runs off.
Oh yeah, He takes care of it.
Yeah. So, but what we have in here is that Abram entered into the agreement with God. Sarai's idea, which is an agreement with Abraham, is to overrule God's plan completely. And so we find that this is a common theme that we follow through the Bible quite often. When God's people lose patience, or they feel like that they've got a better idea, or they're just selfishly motivated, and they will supersede everything that God has already promised in order to have kind of what they want when they want it, which is usually now. Well, that's the world we live in. It's no different. I mean, the promise was made. This is a common practice. But the common, what's another name? What's another word for common? Profane. So the profane things of life have superseded the holy things of life. And so we have to be careful not to let that happen.
I
Which-
do not know common and profane.
Yeah. This is,
To me, profane is
Profanity.
is deeper
Yeah.
to me than common.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
when
I
you
mean,
use
just the
when
way
you use
we use it. I guess.
yeah,
What's
when
that?
you use profanity, you're making if you profane against God, you're making what is holy a common
Okay.
everyday,
Yeah.
and so that's where it comes from.
Okay.
Okay, so it's about the holiness.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, common, we're just
You-
common.
it
people.
draws
We're
its-
just profane
It draws its
people.
depth
Right.
as an antonym in contrast to
Gotcha. Gotcha.
yeah.
They used to refer to it as like the vulgar tongue. as
Yeah,
opposed
the
to,
vulgar,
like,
yes.
the Latin, right? Because if you use like your vernacular, like the normal spoken language among common people, that's the vulgar tongue. You can't. That's why you couldn't read the Bible in like regular language for a long time.
Right.
Only Latin.
Okay. Only Latin.
Gotcha.
Makes sense.
And Koine Greek would have been considered
Yeah.
a profane language to the Greeks, the classical Greeks. Yeah.
Hmm.
Anyway, I hope that's not all we learned tonight.
No, it was just that.
Yeah.
To me about plain English language here.
We speak English.
Yeah.
So Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar, her Egyptian slave. They keep reminding us of this.
Yes.
So that this is all Sarai. It's her slave. It's her idea. It's her everything. And gave her to her husband. All right, Abram, as his wife for him. So what has happened now? God didn't just make a promise to Abram. He also promised that Sarah would be, in this promise. But now Sarai is giving away her promise, in the real sense of the word.
Yeah.
Now, culturally, she's saying, I can have this son back. Once it's born, it'll be mine because she's my slave. So this whole proxy business slips in to where we can deal with God on our terms, forget about what he said, because in the end, this is the way we do things.
Isn't that what America's trying to do now?
This is our culture.
We're going to be transgender. We're going to be homosexual because this is what we want. Not what God says. This is what we want.
That's right.
Nothing doing this son.
So it does have mirrors and tones and echoes to all these other things. So that's what he did. Took him as wife. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan for 10 years. So 10 years beyond, really about the time he put up the first altar to God, all this is happening. He slept with or entered into Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. What does this mean? It means that she couldn't stand the sight of Sarah,
That's right.
the one that had set all this up. Okay? Now, I don't want anything to do with her. And this is the thinking. If she thinks that she's going to take my child, okay, and cut me out of this whole promise deal that's going on, you see, that she's got another thing coming.
Can I throw something in there?
Sure.
So the Hebrew word with the contemptible, right?
Yes.
It's the same word in Genesis 12:3. The curse, the diminish, kalal is the Hebrew word.
Yeah.
She was diminishing Sarai because I've got a kid now. I'm taking your promise. So she was looking down on Sarah.
In your face, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's super huge because it's like drawing back to the promise of Abraham.
Right. That's right. Yeah, it ties, it's almost like bookends to the story.
Right.
Yeah.
That one word. Yeah. So it's not peace in the camp by any means. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering."
Of course.
You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried.
It's better than any written novel or movie today.
I tell people that all the
time. Yeah, you want to
Any
read
genre
good.
you want is in here. You need
Now-
to read.
Yeah.
Now how can this? Let's just stop for a minute because we have to figure out why she would believe that this is his responsibility.
Because it backfired.
Well,
Backfired.
okay,
It did.
things didn't
Well,
work out.
it
Got to
did.
blame somebody.
I mean, it did. She
Yeah.
got pregnant and now
She's taking over the tent. And
she's
she's
the
running.
one that's maybe calling
So
the
so
shots.
is Sarai
Yeah.
upset that the promise that God has made to Abram has led to this plan that she's come up with for a child because she's fearful that God cannot fulfill the promise of a 99-year-old, nearly 99-year-old person fathering a child and an 89-year-old giving birth to one?
I wonder how old Hagar was.
That's a
I'm
good
just-
question.
I'm just curious. I mean,
She was probably
Childbearing
younger.
age.
yes,
Yeah.
she was probably much younger then.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she was a servant, so I would think that
She was strong and healthy. And
Yeah.
young,
that she would be
Yeah,
younger.
you didn't sell old women as slaves. I'm not the,
Yeah,
it
but
was
no,
young, it was young women that
Yeah,
were.
yeah, and it's been 10 years.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, she's been there a while. So.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could say probably as late as 30, mid 30s.
Maybe,
Yeah. So he says, "You're responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between you and me," which is a common idiom of the day to say, let God decide who's right here. So all of a sudden now, it's important that God's in the picture, although she hasn't really wanted to follow anything that God's done to this point. So this whole thing is a strengthening faith by trial that is self-created by Abram and Sarai, but now they're at a point now where they've got to get through this and back to God. That's the tension in the story that the readers are looking for. How do they get back to the place where God is able to, with gusto, with great desire to fulfill the promise that He's made? Where is that going to come from? Okay, and we find out that it doesn't come from Abram and Sarai. It ultimately is going to come from Hagar.
Hagar.
Mm-hmm.
She's going to have to not be so contemptible with her mistress anymore.
Well, when we get into this, where the names, now we begin to see where these names begin to mean a lot. Well, it has all the way through, and most of them that we've looked at have been names in passing, but here we're intimate with these names. So I just wanted to kind of put that on the radar as we move into this, because it says, so Abram replied to Sarai, I don't know what you say at this point, but he comes up with this: "Here, your slave is in your power. Do whatever you want with her."
He's trying to keep peace.
That's it.
So,
You're
yeah.
my life communion.
Yeah. Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. Okay, so let's go back full circle. The whole idea was to provide a child for the promise. And by the end of this little cycle of the story, Sarai's made life so miserable for this child that he and his mother his mother carries him off into the wilderness to run away. So nothing has been accomplished positively, but everything negatively has been accomplished. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and God has been, he was relegated to the sidelines in the whole thing, and he lets it happen. He doesn't step in and say, oh no, you can't do that, Abram, or Sarah, you're making this terrible. He doesn't do any of that.
He doesn't do that to us either.
No.
Mm-hmm.
And why is that? Because he's made the promise already.
Yeah.
So-
We're the ones that have the problem.
Yeah,
That's
his
right.
story, he's not in a hurry.
And he's given us free will in everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In our life, and if
Yeah.
we make the
If we choose
mistake
not to
of
follow.
choosing the wrong thing, then without checking with
Because
him
what he
first,
God,
said is
yeah.
settled, and we're learning that and experiencing God. When he says that, he's going to do it.
That's right.
With or
That's
without
exactly
us.
right.
That's right.
He's
That's
going
right.
to get it done. Yeah.
And so for Abram, he could be 100 years old, he could be 150 years old. God is not concerned about that.
No.
They're concerned because they've lived in a world that is in decay, that ages, that where things like childbearing after a certain point in time comes to an end. And they believe that God has to work within that framework, even though he's making promises otherwise. So this is we're beginning to see how God is using this as a faith-building exercise, because at some point he has to come back in, and it has to be in the right way on his terms. And like we said, that's going to be Hagar in the way that happens, which is wild. So the angel of the Lord, and so often, what's that word I try to say? Theophany.
Yeah.
There's a lot of commentators that believe that
This is
when
a
we-
theophany or not.
well, when you see the title "Angel of the Lord," they sometimes consider that a theophany of Jesus that has appeared,
The Old Testament.
pre virgin birth, which could just be the angel of the Lord. But either way, it's a being beyond the constructs of what's been laid out here in this story. There's someone coming in from the outside to give repair and really to give a sense of dignity to what's happening here. And it's not coming from human beings. It's coming from the angel of the Lord, or the source is God.
I like to think it's Jesus, though, because every time we see Angel of the Lord, he's coming to somebody's rescue, and he is fixing the situation.
Yeah.
Just not Dr. Phil.
So he says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness. The spring was on the way to Shur, so she's headed back where? Egypt.
Yeah.
She's going on. Okay. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, okay, where have you come from and where are you going? Okay, these are very important questions, right?
Doesn't that sound like Jesus' questions?
Yeah.
Why are you here
Yeah.
walking at the well? Tell me about your life.
Yeah. So here we're examining two things. What has happened in your life that has brought you to this place of despondency? Because she had nowhere to go. She was hopeless at this point. So where did you come from? She knows exactly what she's come from, but she may not know where she's going other than, I'm going home.
Yeah, I'm just leaving.
Okay. So in this exchange, we find that because of this, the way this whole situation is handled, God has a better plan than what even Sarai and Abraham had, of course, but even a better plan than what Hagar has, because she has no plan. She's just going to try to get through the desert and back home. So she said, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. So the angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her authority. Okay. He could have said a lot of things at this point. Going back is important because he's going to arrange for Ishmael's care there. And also because Ishmael is going to partake in the circumcision covenant along with all of Abram's other children that he ultimately will have, Isaac, and all of his clansmen and everybody that's of age. So God has and he has a spiritual intention for her going back with him that is going to carry through even till today. And then to submit to her authority. So what is the angel looking for here when he says you're going to go back and submit to her authority?
Obedience on her part.
Yes. There's a place where, Hagar, you did not ask for this, but yet here you are in it, and there's only one way through it, and that is through submission.
And I wonder how far along she is. Like, is she 4 or 5 months pregnant and think she's going to walk across the desert and it's going to be okay? I mean, he's probably, here's a hysterical pregnant woman. Let me just tell her to go home.
Yeah, maybe it's the only sane thing you can say to a woman that's emotionally distraught and decided this is the way out. And then he goes on, the angel of the Lord said to her. So here we are. We've been reminded 3 times of who this is. And whenever we encounter anything in threes in these narratives, we decide this is highly authoritative. And so the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. So a similar promise, right? That he's given to Abram and Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, which means what? Anybody know?
Yeah. Tell us. Harris is our scholar.
Looking at it. Listens to God or something like that. God listens, that's it, I think.
God sees.
Sees.
I didn't think Ishmael was God's seed.
Mine says God hears.
God hears?
I'll go. I didn't see.
God hears, I'm sorry. I clicked on the wrong link. Yeah.
God sees is our Lord.
It's Shema plus L plus a yeesh.
So she named the Lord. Yeah, that's I clicked on the wrong link. Sorry. So you will name him God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. Okay, so she's going back to Sarai and Abraham, and when this child is born, it's going to be named Ishmael, so that every time she calls his name, Abram and Sarai are going to be reminded, God hears. Yeah. And this is reiterated for us when the visitors come and they say that she's gonna, at this time next year you're going to have a son, and she laughs, and they heard. So the way that it's reiterated in the long view of the story. So yeah, Ishmael is God hears, for he's heard your cry of affliction. Then it says, this man will be like a wild donkey. I love that description. His hand will be against everyone. This is not going to be a well-liked boy in the neighborhood.
Isn't this the Muslims' ancestor?
Arabs. Muslims are Arabs and others, but it's a religion that was made by Muhammad.
And everyone against him. I think that's where we are. 2,000 years later, we're still fighting with Ishmael.
Yes.
I mean, it's just
And what religious group did they become?
So the race is Arab. Okay.
Arab.
So when you look over at Saudi Arabia and Iraq are Arabs.
Okay.
And that whole extended peninsula, and then when you get into Iran, more Persian descent, but still Arab, just watered down a little bit with Indian
and whatever
that whole
religions are over
Indo-European
there.
group.
still in that lineage.
Yeah.
And so that leads you to the fact of what if Sarah had just left everything alone?
We might not have had.
We might not have
Right.
known
We might not be dealing with we would be or something.
Yeah,
Something, but it might be
Something.
Yeah. So when we look at this conversation we're having about today, we begin to understand why the circumcision that Ishmael is a part of later becomes so important, because that becomes the way in which we acknowledge the covenant that God has made with us. And it's not just for us; it's for the Arabs too.
It's for everyone.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
It's for everyone.
So his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives. We don't know who that is.
Who was that?
I don't know of any. I couldn't find anything. I looked and looked, looking for some way to discover who that might be. We know that Abraham's family is going to be his relatives,
Yes.
and we know that the Egyptians are going to be his relatives. And so it says that he will settle near. But I think what he's meaning here is Egyptians. But I can't be certain of that. So she named the Lord who spoke to her El Roi, God sees me. So when she refers to the God that is speaking to Abram, she refers to him as the God who sees me. So he hears and he sees. For she said, in this place I have actually seen the one who sees me. So now we get the first time that we've been told that this angel of the Lord that appears is actually visible to her. But she refers to what she has seen as God sees me. God sees me and I see what I'm seeing. That is why the well near that town, Belaheroi, probably not it, but anyway.
Sounds good.
That's what it's called. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son. So he calls it Abram's son. And Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. So how does he come upon that? Hagar's gone back and told the story. She's told everybody exactly what God has said to her and exactly what he's done for her. And Abram honors it. So this is how God is setting it right again. He does this wonderful, marvelous thing for Hagar and her unborn child.
And you know he saw a different Hagar when she came back.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, everything's going to be different now. Look, does Sarai have any power over Hagar anymore? No. The promise to hers is as secure as the promise to Abram. So this happens. Oh heck, there was something else I was going to say about that. It'll come to me later at about 1:30 this morning, but I promise I won't call anybody.
You tell me, I'll stop.
Just text it. Write it down.
Text it, that's right. Text
We'll
it.
see it.
Oh, this is what I was going to say. Okay, so Abram names this child exactly what God tells Hagar to name it. Okay, so God's word in the middle of this whole episode comes to Abram again, but not directly from God. It has to come from him.
Good stuff.
See? Yeah. That you're not listening to me anymore, but you can listen to her, because I've heard her and she has seen me. So those are two very important things. In relationship, we want to be known and we want to be loved. We're known by the way that we are received, through our hearing and through our speaking and through the way. Yeah. So yeah. So Hagar gave birth. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. So he's 86. He's not getting any younger. All right, any more comments about that? I love the story because of the names. Hagar doesn't have any real connection with Yahweh other than what she's probably overhearing.
As being part of their household.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so now this terrible thing happens. First of all, she's sold into slavery. She's used to bring about an end that she knows is not going to bring her any honor. Her child's going to be taken away from her. So all of this is happening in her life. Then Sarai mistreats her really it's almost like all the mistakes that Sarah had made, she takes out on Hagar, to the point to where she would rather go into the desert and possibly die than deal with this. And God shows up in the midst of her despondency and says, "No, I've got a promise for you."
Someone's here, and I recognize him, and he needs a phone, I think.
Jill, will you see with you?
Well, yeah. Yeah, if it is, hold on. Let me go see.
We better
Yeah.
turn out there.
Oh, who is it? Sorry, whoever's watching.
My phone is in.
And mine is too.
I have a phone.
Does anybody care if he?
No.
He said he's broken down. I'm gonna stay. I'm not gonna let the phone walk away.
I just want
Yeah,
to
you do it on
get
speaker.
cards in there.
Yeah, mine does too.
Yeah, I
There we go.
just where's your keypad? Okay,
There
that's
we
where
go.
Okay, the other thing that we haven't talked about in the midst of this story is that Abram's offspring are going to be a blessing to the nations. And Ishmael's offspring are going to be wild donkeys.
Gosh.
Okay? So in this whole thing, we've set up a conflict, okay, that exists. Promises have been made to both, but the promise doesn't determine the outcome in either situation. And how do we know this? We fast forward to Jeroboam of Nebat, who's rebelled from the southern kingdom and worshiping idols. Okay, he's the one that's a wild donkey when we get to that point. Okay, and he's leading off the 10 tribes in the northern part of Israel into this terrible place of idol worship and all of those things. And so the lines aren't always clear, but what is clear is that all the way through, God has kept his promises. And how we respond to that winds up meaning a great deal. Not just to us as individuals, but to the world that we live in. And we see that in this racial conflict that exists between the Jews and the Arabs today in various ways, shapes, and forms. All right. Well, if y'all don't have anything to say about 7:16, that was quick. We did that in 35 minutes.
All right.
It's the fastest we've ever got through.
I was going to tell you too, mine has a reference. If we're talking about the.
If your phone rings back, it's his daughter, and he said we would just tell her to please pick him up. He's going to be walking towards the interstate. He said he's having. I don't know if he got put out, but his phone is not working. I believe he needs. And so anyhow, but whatever that last number
This is his daughter. Yes, ma'am. That's what I was looking at.
So that's what he said. If she
Albany.
happens to call back, just let her know that your dad, Danny, said he's walking down 447 towards the interstate. Could he please determine
the ringer on if I'm going to hear a phone call. So I put it on low.
Okay, the other interesting thing about this whole thing with Ishmael is when Joseph's brothers have had enough of Joseph. Okay, because he's arrogant and he doesn't know how to keep his mouth shut. And they decide they're going to kill him, but instead they don't. They sell him into slavery, and it ultimately winds up in Egypt. Who did they sell Joseph to?
the Egyptian?
The Ishmaelites, who took him into Egypt.
Yeah,
So almost immediately in the story we have this conflict that is the small story, Joseph and the Ishmaelites, that ultimately grow into this larger story.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So
it goes all the way back to the original.
all the way back. Yeah.
Back and forth.
And I don't remember how many of the Jebusites and all them people, Karasites, that descended from out of the Ishmaelites.
Why does all of it have lights at the end? What's the deal with that?
I don't know.
Parasites.
That's just how you refer to it.
Parasites.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just curious,
But
maybe.
just really like people.
Like a walker right. I don't know.
Okay.
All right, so it was 86 when this happened. Now it's 99.
Mm.
If you don't think God moves slow,
13 years.
And
Verse
that's
from
Abram
verse
and
15 to verse 1, 13
Yeah.
years.
So we talked about this being a God using this testing faith. So they kind of failed miserably at the test. The covenant that's made, Abraham should have been totally convinced and totally assured that God was going to do what he said. Ultimately falls into this plan, him and Sarai. And so their faith in God was tested, and out of it, you would think, oh, terrible destruction has come because they didn't have faith in God. But what God does is bring blessing out of the destruction and blesses Ishmael, and is going to make, well, it blesses. He tells Hagar that her children are going to be a great nation too. So it could have ended in tragedy, but it doesn't end in tragedy. And in the end, Abram is beginning to hear. He hears from Hagar, this is what God wants you to do, and he does it. So in this roundabout way, the activity of faith is restored, and now it's including more. So some of what God promised when he told Abram at the very beginning that you're going to be a blessing to the nations is kind of coming true in a roundabout way. So God can take our mistakes and the results of our unfaithfulness, and he can actually weave it into his plan that he's had going all along. I thought that was important.
It is.
All right.
And that God of the second chance, no chance, bad chance. He can just do it.
He can just do it. So when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him. This is not the Lord Almighty. When he came to Hagar, his title is the Lord Almighty. The first time it's used in the Bible, and now we're back to. So there's like names for relationships here. So the Lord appeared to him saying, he says, I am God Almighty. All right. Live in my presence and be blameless. I will set up my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly. That's a lot right there. First of all, I'm the Lord God Almighty. He is now sharing his name. The name that he shared with Hagar is now the name that he's revealing to Abram. So he's building connection in some sort of way that is important to the rest of the story. He says, live in my presence and be blameless. Let's just take that apart a little bit. What would it mean? What would that mean? Live in my presence is pretty clear.
Don't be listening to your wife and be having more babies when
Yeah.
I told you not to do it that way.
Okay.
You learned this lesson, boy.
So the promise is not an abstract here. It is living and breathing before God. We don't have to worry about it. We don't spiritualize the promise. It's flesh and bone. Live in my presence and be blameless. No, so you live the way I want you to live. Everything will be all right. I will set up my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly. So this is how many times has he promised his multiplication?
Yeah,
Many, many times. So it's restating his directive to Adam and Eve to multiply, and he's done this over and over again now. It's important to God that his image bearer multiply in the world. And Abraham, good, bad, ugly, is the image bearer that God intends to shape and mold till all the nations will see who he is. Then Abram fell face down, and God spoke with him. As for me, here is my covenant with you. You will become the father of many nations. So this is the same promise, right? God hasn't changed a thing. He's restating for him. Only this is about to change. Your name will no longer be Abram, which means the father is exalted. So when Terah named Abram, it is as if Terah was saying, this son exalts me. Okay? The father is exalted. Terah wasn't a God-fearer. So he says, that was your name, but now your name will be Abraham. And what does it mean? The father of a multitude. So the old name was looking back to his heritage as the son of Terah, and now this name is looking forward. You're going to be the father of a multitude. So it's another important pivot point in the story, because God is ready to take another step with Abram. It's time to move on. Your past is past, and the future awaits. For I will make you the father of many nations. Seemed like he just said that. He did. First of all, it says you will become, and then he says I will make. So the becoming is not left. There's no doubt as to how he will become a father of many nations. God will make him a father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, which he's probably thinking now. You mean a lot of kids? I'm just needing one kid. But of course, the fruit, I'm probably that guy. The fruitfulness certainly has to do with many nations.
Was your dad?
Danny. The man's name was Danny.
Danny? Is that your father, Danny? Oh, it's a friend. Okay. Well, he's broke down, and he's walking.
He said to Ted he's going to be walking towards the interstate on 447.
He's going to be on 447 walking toward the interstate.
From Hammock Road.
Yeah.
He just borrowed my phone. I guess his is dead.
Yes.
Mhm.
His is dead.
Okay. Yes. Well, he's already started walking.
This is a church.
South Walker. He's walking toward the interstate. Okay, Hammock Road. He started from Hammock Road, and that's where he's hiking from Hammock Road down to the interstate. I know. All right, hon. Yeah, I hope so too. All right, bye-bye.
Can you delete? So she says it's not. Was it a girl?
Yeah, it's a
Okay, because he said it was college.
It's a friend.
He's a
friend.
friend.
His daughter. Okay. Well, hopefully. Don't let him walk.
He probably used up all his get out of jail free cards with his daughter.
Smart.
So, all right. So verse 7 in chapter 17, it says, "I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring throughout the generations." So, there's been a covenant, and God made this covenant with Abram, and then he kind of didn't pay much attention to it. And so now he's saying, I'm going to confirm the covenant with you and with your offspring. So what he's about to do is to communicate the permanence of the situation. All right? It is a permanent covenant between your God and the God of your offspring after you. So he's making clear again, what we're talking about doing here is going to allow you to understand that what I'm about is permanent. There's no way to reverse it. Okay? We're moving to circumcision in a real way. So we learn up front, there's all kind of reasons why circumcision was done at this particular point in history. but God is redefining it with his people. Okay, so one of them is this, to show that my covenant with you is permanent. And that also that what we will do, your offspring will do, and it will be carried in their bodies that this is permanent. This has become an important part of this. And to you and your future offspring I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. So this covenant that he is stating has to do with, it's a permanent covenant. It has to do with geography. And it also has to do with fidelity to God. Okay? So there's genealogy, there's geography, there's fidelity. And then there's the permanence of this covenant that is going to mark these people. Okay?
I'm so good thinking that this is some of y'all spirit we're talking about here. Panicking.
God also said to Abraham, as for you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, you and your offspring after you throughout the generations are to keep my covenant. So what was the covenant up to this point? Between God and Abram.
About becoming a great nation.
Yeah. I will bless you, and you will be a blessing to the nations. That's really the only thing that Abram was ever asked to do, was to be a blessing to the nations. God had determined how he was going to do that. He was going to provide Sarai and him with offspring. That offspring was going to multiply like the stars in the sky, and they were all going to become a nation of priests, showing the world who God is. So this is the part that's the part of the covenant that they keep. You are to keep my covenant. All right? The other side of that argument is this. God makes the covenant, and he solely does it on his own, and we either accept it or reject it. So if we keep it, we accept it. Okay? But if we don't keep it, we reject it. All right? So it's not unlike how God deals with the kings in the latter days. If you seek me out, I will allow myself to be found. So I'm going to allow our relationship to exist. But if you reject me, I will reject you. What he tells them several times. So keeping the covenant, claiming it as theirs, becomes very important. So he says, this is my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you, which you are to keep. Every one of your males must be circumcised. All right? So, the way in which circumcision works is you've accepted the covenant with me, Abram, and this is the way you keep it. This is the way you hang on to it. You do this thing that I've asked you to do. There's all sorts of reasons why circumcision was a part of the cultural life of the day, which I don't think they had anything to do. I don't think God had any. I don't think any of that played into this. I've heard it said, well, it's a hygiene thing, and so that's why God gave the command to keep the covenant like this, and so on and so forth. But I think what God is doing here is in a very micro way saying this, that that flesh and blood is going to be
Our covenant.
Yeah,
because the circumcision wasn't mandatory. It's still not today.
yeah,
If people don't, I mean, Christians tend to always want that for their
Right.
boys.
right,
But it was not, quote, hygiene or any of that necessary, because it's not necessary
right.
today.
That's right. God's thing about this is that
There's going to be blood.
literally,
Oh, yeah.
this is where when you've heard the term, you got skin in the game. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but this is where it comes from.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it was about.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's saying, okay, flesh and blood. There's an offering here that you're giving. This is what states to me.
And it can't really
That you
come
keep
from
it.
an animal. It's got to come from the
That-
man himself.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
You know,
right.
otherwise, he would have said, "Go get a sacrifice, sacrifice this to me." But for this covenant, this was something that the man was having to make that sacrifice.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and we see it later with King David and his people. I mean, when he circumcises a bunch of grown
Oh,
men.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
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 Yeah. So, Harris, you got anything to add with that?
Well, I think that circumcision is a huge, huge topic because it's like, I think it's a really beautiful sign in the first place. It's like, you know, there's the idea of separation, and I think that's really what it was getting at. Like, you circumcise your young because they're set apart wholly for God.
That's right.
And in a way, in an Old Testament way, it's an ethnic, like, distinction.
Right.
And that
Oh,
matches a spiritual distinction that they have from the surrounding people. I think that it's taken too far by some denominations, though. I think that if you look at like Presbyterians, who will make a case for infant baptism, they will say that the baptism of the new covenant is the circumcision of the old covenant.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
the sign continues in through. So baptism
Yeah,
is the new
that's too far.
circumcision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's their main argument there. And that's why we should baptize babies.
So that's
Yeah.
No.
Right.
That is far.
See, yeah.
and so they
Or a whole
they
paper on it.
they pull that out of Galatians, I guess, and where
Where's the
Paul's
circumcision of the
Galatians.
heart? Isn't there also with those chapters
Deuteronomy.
yeah
somewhere?
Deuteronomy
Yeah.
talks about
Okay.
circumcision of the heart. Yeah.
There's one place in Colossians 2 where Paul connects the idea of circumcision and baptism, but he says circumcise your hearts.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a new circumcision,
Yeah.
this thing like that. So, you know, there's we kind of glance over this, but there are some like churches that will sit
That
here.
really go too far with it in
Yeah.
salvation.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I
It's
started
interesting.
looking up in articles, and I'm thinking, man, yeah, this is more than we can go over in a week of Sundays talking about it.
Yeah, because it goes even further with the cutting away too. I mean, there's more involved
Yeah,
of getting all that stuff out of your life. What else is God wanting to cut away? We're not just talking about skin here, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
what else needs to be cut away?
yes.
Yeah, game, what to say.
I won't think. I see what you learned when you came to Bible studies.
So what's the expansion right now?
That's a good one.
451.
Oh yeah.
He goes on to say that it's a sign,
Yeah.
so that it seals the deal. If you're doing this, you know, it means that you're following. For those after this, you're following the covenant that I made with your forefathers. So Abram never, the importance of Abram's never lost, and it's carried significantly in the act of circumcision too. Ties together that God's promise that He makes is this timeless promise. Well, yeah,
Romans
there's so much we
4.
can do.
Romans 4 is so good. Just because I love the point that Paul makes when he's saying, like, when did Abraham get called righteous? Was it when he received the sign of the covenant? When he followed the law perfectly? Or was it whenever, in Genesis 15, whenever he believed in God, he had faith in God? That's when he was declared righteous.
That's right.
And
That's
it's
right.
not when he did the right thing with the Jews,
That's
which
right.
the Pharisees were so crazy about following the law. It's when he believed in God.
That's it.
Genesis 15, not the
All these other things are functional to that, but not. They didn't cause him to believe. Yeah, that's right. All right, verse 11. No, verse 12. Throughout your generations, every male among you is to be circumcised at 8 days old. Every male born to your household or purchased by from any foreigner, and not your offspring. So everybody in your camp
Didn't matter what they're.
undergoes this at 8 days. So beyond the creation day and the resting day, it's a new day.
And they
New
even
set of
proved, I know we'll change this, but they even proved that's even better for babies on
Yeah,
that day. There's
yeah.
something going on with them, even though they
'Cause
don't
of-
follow that anymore, because you take your little boy daddy's home done, but
That's right.
But they had proven that something
Yeah.
about that day to day, it's less whatever.
Then he repeats, whether born in your household or purchased, he must be circumcised. So, because the promise that God has made is going to be of benefit to everyone that Abram has in his life, because he's to be a blessing. My covenant marked in your flesh, my covenant will be marked in your flesh as a permanent covenant. Can't undo a circumcision. If any male is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that man will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. All right? So, this certainly would not apply to the 8 days old children. It's those really in this immediate context, or those that come into the household as slaves or some other way. So yeah, you could imagine that there were some that would balk at that idea and say they're not doing that, and he would be cut off from the rest of.
Could be part of any kind of blessing.
Right, that's right. Yeah, you cut yourself off from the covenant. Wow. So circumcision of the heart becomes the right expression, because if we don't have that, then we can't enjoy the covenant promises of Christ and his blood. So, yeah. All right. God said to Abraham, now he's called him Abraham, his new name, as for your wife Sarai, we're going to take her out back and have a good talking. No, it's not what I'm saying. Do not call her Sarai, for Sarah will be her name. What's Sarah mean? Princess.
You should have named me Sarah.
I had little to say about your name. Your mother had already made up her mind.
You're named after a
She
farm.
said, I will have her and you get to raise her. Yeah. She said, we're going to name her Shelby with an I. And I'm assuming that's from Steel Magnolias or something. I don't know.
Never watched that movie.
I've never known your mother to be that sentimental, but it could be.
Shelby was beautiful on Steel Magnolias.
You probably just find her name.
Julia Roberts.
So everybody's got a new name, and it's part of this covenant making process. The oldest gone, the newest come.
I knew you were going there.
You knew I was going there. Yeah, that's what it is. And then he says, I will bless her indeed. I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will produce nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. So now, a verbal extension of the promise that's made to Abraham is also made to Sarah. God has done everything he can possibly do to convince this couple that he means business. Even to the point of demanding, look, you've got skin in the game. I wouldn't be doing any of this if I didn't mean what I was saying. And I know that sounds kind of trite to say it that way, but I think that's how God has to deal with us a lot of times. We just have to sit back and accept the fact that God's going to be God in the way that he's determined it he will be for our life. And we may not understand it. We may not always agree with it. We may not even always like it. But it's going to happen. And so the sooner that we embrace that and choose to live in that, I really believe that his plan of being a blessing, because we're the new righteous, right? That begins sooner. I mean, look how long this is taking. And it's because he kept stubbing his toe along the way and doing some pretty stupid things. But we've been given all of that, as Paul says, to learn from. We don't have to repeat these same problems again.
But we make up all new ones.
Yeah. So Abram fell face down. Then he laughed.
To himself.
He thought it was to himself.
Sarah, they enjoy a good laugh.
Yeah. He fell face down. He's already fallen face down when God started speaking to him. Now he's face down again and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? So Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael were acceptable to you. Can you believe this?
He's still
After
questioning.
all of
Still
yes.
questioning God.
Jeez.
Well, what he's saying is, we've got a solution, God.
Yeah.
Why can't you accept it?
We
No.
fixed it. We fixed it. Why don't you take this?
Yeah. Thinking, boy, this rings familiar in my ears. Can't think of the time. God, I got this plan already. Just
please-
put your stamp
please-
on it and
Please
let me go.
adjust your plans to mine.
Yeah. 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 Can't we make a commercial where you endorse what I'm doing?
Yeah.
You know, and that's really what's happened here. He says, if only Ishmael was acceptable. It's God's problem again. It's almost every time we go through these covenant events, Abram manages to flip the whole thing over where he's missed the whole point. But God said, no. Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac.
So this is the first time he's given a name, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. I will confirm. Now, he's laughing this time. Later on, Sarah does the laughing. They all get into the game. I will confirm my covenant with him as a permanent covenant for his future offspring, meaning he is going to be circumcised to confirm this, everything that I've done. He's going to carry it. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Okay. Now, it makes it, we kind of have to read between the lines here, but Abram seems to have a deep concern for Ishmael at this point, that we're not able to pull out of the language, at least not the English. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will certainly bless him. I will make him fruitful and will multiply him greatly. He will father 12 tribal leaders. Okay. And I will make him into a great nation. But I will confirm my covenant with Isaac. So,
And Sarah will have next year.
So he's actually saying, I'm putting a timeline on
It's
it. So
here,
y'all
boy.
go do something stupid
It's here,
before
boy.
the end of the year.
That's right.
now this is interesting. He says, I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, but yet Ishmael is circumcised. So he's circumcised without the confirmation of the covenant. It's only for Isaac. Why is it only for Isaac? Because God said it was only for Isaac. There's nothing else in this that leads us to say that Isaac has been set apart in any other way, only than God has said, I've been saying this all along, and I'm going to say it again, that Isaac's going to be the guy. It's going to be Sarah's son. Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
it makes you think too, because, I mean, he wants him circumcised, but he does say, I'm going to bless him. I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply
Yeah.
him greatly.
Yeah.
Which was the same promise he gave.
So
He
it's
gave Hagar that promise.
it's the
so
same-
That's
it's-
kind of a covenant.
but it's the same blessing, but it doesn't include the same promise.
Yeah.
So God is extravagant in the way that he deals with people. But for his promise, he's very stingy. He makes the promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Sarah.
Yeah, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it.
Not take
Yeah.
your mind.
So they're the promise, and of course Jesus comes through
That
that
lineage.
lineage
Yeah.
and really becomes the focal point of that promise, so that
And it
Abram
could
truly
have
does
been
become a blessing
Ishmael.
to all the nations, including Ishmael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it couldn't have been Ishmael for the promise because
That's right.
Christ was never going to come through that
That's
lineage.
exactly
right.
right.
He was always going to come through Abraham's
Yeah.
lineage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or through Sarah's
Through
lineage.
Sarah.
Yeah.
Because-
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's the significant
That's right.
part of this, is that the promise is made as a package deal. Just like God said to Adam and Eve, you two together be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. Okay, and so he's doing this, it's a package deal again
Right.
Yeah.
with Abram. So Abram and Sarah are really the starting over place
That's right.
again, you know.
The new Adam and Eve. I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So he says, I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. So now we got a date certain. When he finished talking to him, God withdrew from Abraham. So we have this great picture. I've always pictured this as God settling in like he does on Sinai in a cloud. And this thunder's rolling, and Abraham's able to feel and hear. And yeah, he sees us all caught up in God. And then he just
lifted up.
goes
Yeah.
yeah. Have to have those big pictures or it doesn't make sense to me.
Turn on the television. Let's see some Ten Commandments.
So Abraham took his son Ishmael and those born in his household or purchased, every male among the members of Abraham's household, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin on that very day, just as God had said to him. So here we are. He's finally, after all of these episodes, has heard God and acted in faith immediately. No hesitation.
Well, you didn't give him much time. He's going to bear. She's going to bear a child this time next year, so he better get busy because that was part of that promise. This is what you got to do. So he didn't have time to wait around and listen to everybody complain about what they had to do.
That's right.
So he's 99 years old and just kicking into gear. It gives me a lot of hope. How about it, Raj?
I don't want that kind of hope. I'm going to be gone by that time.
Abram was 99 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. And for people that were reading this, and that had to really bring great visions to your mind. And his son Ishmael was 13 years old when the flesh of his foreskin was circumcised. On that very day, Abram and his son Ishmael were circumcised. So we were left with no doubt. It took them 3 times, and so that's when we know that this was a most important event. Yeah. And all the men of his household, whether born in his household or purchased from the foreigner, were circumcised with him. So the covenant is sealed, finally. God, the first covenant, God did the cutting, right? And it was with the animal, and God passed through between the halves of the animal and declared the covenant and declared who he was, and it was all God, okay? And then this comes along after the debacle with Hagar, and God very extravagantly offering his love and his care and his blessing to this slave woman and her child, which had been caught up in this whole act of unfaithfulness to God, okay? Blesses her, reestablishes his communication, his relationship with Abraham, and the first thing that God wants to do is to find a way to assure Abraham that what he's saying, he says what he means. And so Abram gets to participate now through circumcision. Where flesh and blood are offered as a part of that in order for this covenant to have permanency.
And then a physical visual every day of the rest of his life.
Yeah. And so the flesh and blood of Jesus is offered as a permanent sacrifice, only not just a part, the whole, so that we are indeed a part of a new circumcision that includes that broken body and blood that is shed for us.
And that's why it tells us to take up that cross daily.
Yes.
That's our visual every day.
That's our vision.
Yeah. Even if we wear little crosses.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, whatever, but we should take up our cross daily.
Yeah. We sometimes think that God changed things, or some Christians do believe that God changed things when Jesus came and did what he did to kind of let us off the hook, so to speak. But a circumcised heart is still a circumcised heart.
Isn't that called cheap grace
Yes.
if they think they're off
Absolutely. Well, if you want to read a good book about that,
Oh,
read
Oh,
Bonhoeffer.
yeah.
Yeah.
Cheap about his grace.
And if you want to read a good book about the church, read Bonhoeffer's Life Together. It's still the best of all of them. Okay, so that was 7:17. We went 10 minutes over.